The Factotum's Magnum Opus and the Devil in the Details by Eric Dean. Narrated by Rish, Outfield. It was 9:14 in the morning when I heard the gunshots. Truth be told, I didn't first think 'em gunshots. I knowed what time it was, 'cause the second period bell rang after, and that bell rings at 9:15 on the dot every morning. I didn't think much of it, 'cause I was up to my eyeballs swapping out bad pipes under the old east wing. Damn things were more rust than steel, and I had at least 100 feet to swap before we could open up the east wing faculty facilities again, and the headmaster'd have my head if he had to use the student facilities in the other wings for another week. I thought for sure I was in for a chewing when old headmaster himself stomped in about an hour later with a face more beat than butternut. "Where you been?" he yells at me. "Why, right here, boss," I says, "swapping pipe." He takes me by the sleeve of my coveralls and leads me out to the quad where, by God, the bodies of 12 pupils were laid out haphazard and shot up something awful, worser'n I seen in a heap of years at least. That's when I knowed it was gunshots I'd heard, and I told him so. Headmaster ain't much of one for speeches, but we stood there looking over the carnage for a good minute, and he tells me that one of the first-year boys had somehow gotten the gamekeeper's repeater and put down a dozen other students before he turned it on himself, screaming something about going home, he said. He knowed there weren't no going home, nor a home to go back to, lest maybe he weren't talking about the same kind of earthly home as most of the kids meant when they'd whisper it to each other after lights out. A small part of me wondered whether maybe his mind weren't all twisted. Anyway, headmaster then tells me Muta'd already tossed that boy in the furnace for later cremating, 'cause he, like others for him, didn't deserve a proper hole in the ground. But I wasn't for sure if he meant the north or west wing furnace, 'cause it definitely weren't the east, or I'd have seen him. The north wing furnace had been thick with creosote since Muta'd burned a load of green wood in it, and I hadn't yet had a moment to clean it. Fat had burned hot enough to spark that creosote up something fiercer'n a leveler's breath, so I decided I'd better check as soon as we were done here. Classes are canceled for the day, he tells me, and the pupils have all been confined to the dormitories. But classes will start on time tomorrow, by God, he says, so I'd better have this mess cleaned up before the sun rises. What do you want me to do with 'em, I ask. He tells me to dig 'em each a hole right here on the quad. A proper hole. Say a few words, he says, and lay 'em down respectfully. I says I can do that, and he nods and tells me to do it after I finish swapping pipe, 'cause he ain't keen on using the student facilities for another week. Then he walks off in a hurry toward his estate, no doubt to write all this up in his correspondence with the governing council. Another small part of me knowed that, despite the understood tragedy of the day's happenings, the headmaster'd be a tiny bit tickled to use the new stationery he'd made up for the council's triennial audit. It's later afternoon by the time I finish the pipes, and I head back to the quad to find Muta standing slack-jawed o'er the bodies and swaying like a lodgepole pine. Damn good worker, that boy, but couldn't think a lick for himself. I tells him to go grab the shovels, and he does, but while I'm waiting and looking o'er the bodies, I start thinking. It's awful unfortunate what happened to these pups, and I figured maybe they needed more than just holes in the ground. A heap of years, at least, like I said, since I seen one this bad, and something just told me I might could do better'n holes. Maybe I could say something here I've been needing to say. Anyway, I look around, and I see the old oak stump dead center of the quad what Muta and I'd cut down only last spring after she got split by a lightning strike must have been tossed by Zeus himself. Damn impressive stump. Big as a dinner table and almost as high. I tell Muta we ought to dig a dozen holes in a circle right round that stump. Seems more meaningful, I says, and we ought to mark 'em somehow. Then it hits me. I had a load of rusted pipe in the basement of the old east wing. At least 100 feet of the stuff. It was too full of holes to run water through, but it'd make a damn fine grave marker. I tell Muta to fetch me that pipe and a hacksaw to cut it with. How long should I cut it, I wonder? Then I get another idea. I tell Muta to fetch my measuring tape while he's at it. I figure I can measure each of these poor young'uns from head to toe and cut a piece of pipe that'll stand atop their grave the same height as they'd have stood. Were they still standing, of course. While he's gone, I start to dig the first hole, picturing the final product in my mind's eye, as you do. And I get another idea. If I ran some chain from pole to pole, leaving a little slack, I could chain off the stump like a right proper monument. A symbol of untimely death, of being cut down in your prime by an unexpected tragedy, befitting both the mother oak and these poor kids gathered round her feet. Seems a pretty bit of symbolism to me, and for a minute I ain't so sorry she got split open. In fact, the chain running from pole to pole might look a bit like the kids standing hand in hand round the stump. The thought almost brings a tear to my eye. I know there's a mess of chain at the gamekeeper's shack, and a cutter, and considering his part in all this, I don't think he'd object too much to my using it. I head that way, and figure I can grab my welding rig from the garage while I'm over yonder. The sun's setting by the time I drag the chain and welding rig back, and I find Muta cross-legged in the grass picking at a planter wart. I tell him we're going to need the oil lamps, 'cause we'll probably be working through the night. I start measuring the whelps and cutting the pipes to size, and when Muta gets back with the lamps, I get him onto cutting the chain. I lay out the bodies where they'll each be buried, and I start to realize that with a dozen of them in a circle, they'll be laid out just like a clock face. That gives me another idea, see? If you was, say, looking down on this memorial from an overflying dirigible, you might look down and notice the clock-like appearance, and it might strike you a bit deeper in the cockles if there were hands on that clock, and if they pointed out 9:14, the time when this whole tragedy occurred. I knowed that I had enough extra pipe to do it, and all I'd have to do is weld horizontal pieces from the 9 o'clock marker and one from the 3 o'clock marker, and meet the other ends in the middle of the stump, and I'd have me yet another meaningful aspect to what was quickly becoming my Magnum Opus, if I do say so. I'd probably need to bury another vertical pipe in the center of the stump, so I'd have something to weld the other ends of my hour and minute hands to, else they'd just be resting freely atop the stump, and that didn't seem too aesthetically pleasing. The best way to do that, I figured, was to chip out the heart of the old stump with my biggest carpentry chisel and a sledge. But the boy could swing a hammer hard enough to wake the devil. I put him to task on it and ran back to the garage to fetch some concrete and a bucket of water, enough to set the pole into the heart of the old stump, good and solid. It's dark when I get back, and Muta's chipping away at the heartwood, eyes big as field surgeons' head mirrors, trying to see in the dark. I light up the lanterns and get to work finishing up cutting pipe. When Muta'd got the hole chipped deep enough that I felt the vertical pole'd be secure, I mixed up some concrete and set the pole in it. I couldn't rightly start welding nothing to it quite yet, though, else the weight'd cause the pole to shift off center. I was just about to busy my idle hands and utilize said drying time when I see wisps of black smoke curling like the devil's mustache out of the chimney of the north wing, and suddenly I remember the boy Muta must have dumped in there, and I wager the washing woman must have lit up the furnace for the boiler. Boy, I'd galloped across that quad and into the north wing basement like Cerberus himself had been nipping at my heels. I stifled the blaze, much to the ire of that foreign washing woman, and dragged the little assassin out like a half-scorched ham. I helped her get the fire started again, and dragged the remains on out to the gamekeeper's offal pit, as they should have been initially. Well, I get back to find Muta sucking on the end of one of the cut lengths of chain. The pole was pretty well secured in the center of the stump, so I figured I could start setting the perimeter pipes and welding everything up together. So I gets Muta going, digging post holes, and I start welding up chain behind him as he goes. I think we was a quarter round by the time I remembered we ain't even buried the kids yet, let alone dug holes to bury 'em in. I couldn't see so good outside the circle of light cast by our lanterns, and I guess they was out of sight and out of mind. I know we'd let the hours slip away, and we hadn't the time now, so, with some reluctance, I resigned myself to doing all I had the time left to do. Muta and I dug one big hole next to the stump, and had just enough time to stack the young'uns in like a rick of firewood and cover 'em over with the soil, 'fore the sun started peeking up o'er the east wing. By the time the opening bell rang, Headmaster was already hurrying through throngs of kids towards me and Muta, who was taking a breather on the old stump. "Did you get it done?" he asks me. I tells him I did, and points to the big fresh patch of dirt he's standing on. He steps off it and shakes some dirt from his shoe, nodding and rubbing his temples, and then tells me I done a good job. Then he looks at all the steel and chain and tools and what not laying about, straightens his tie, and tells me I ought to clean all this up in case someone from the council comes by. And while you got the shovels out, dig out that old stump, he says. He starts to walk away, and then turns and tells me I ought to have more pride in my work. He's probably right. Anyway, I'd better get back to it. But it was nice talking to you.